The image you're looking at takes place after one of the most distressing hot air balloon accidents in US history, and despite it having been aired live, it's one of those accidents that have sort of just been completely forgotten to time. This is surprising to me because the situation was absolutely terrifying, and it has an unexpected twist at the end that I don't think most people would see coming. I'll tell you everything, but as usual, let's get into the backstory first. If you've seen volume 7 of this series, you'll know that I've touched on the Albuquerque International Balloon Fiesta before. The festival's generally very safe. I don't want people thinking it has something to do with the event itself, but due to the sheer volume of balloons, the amount of years it's been running, and just the risks of hot air balloons in general, you're gonna have no shortage of incidents over a 50+ year run. It's just how it is. Today's story takes place in 1982, and despite being considered one of the worst accidents in the Fiesta's history, most people have never heard of this. On the morning of October 3rd, 1982, hundreds of balloon pilots would be up bright and early preparing for a big day at the Albuquerque International Balloon Fiesta, which for those who may not know, is the biggest annual hot air balloon event in the entire world. On certain days of the event, they do something called a mass ascension, where countless numbers of balloons fill the sky, and you've probably seen photos of this event without even realizing. Sunday, October 3rd, 1982 was one of these mass ascension days, and the festival goers could not have been more excited. It makes for an extremely beautiful view, and if you wanted to get up there and join, you could pay one of the pilots for a ride. Nowadays, this is all regulated through one specific company to ensure safety and quality control when it comes to picking pilots, but back then it was completely normal to just pay any of the pilots on the ground to take you for a ride. Obviously this was much cooler and easier, like with many things back in the day, but if you unknowingly picked a person who wasn't diligent, you were taking a risk, and that's exactly what happened in today's story. One balloon that was preparing for flight on that fateful day was called the Globo Grande. It was one of the biggest balloons present and was owned and piloted by a man named Joe Gonzalez. Joe was extremely proud of his balloon and had a considerable amount of experience, having been around the scene for a decent amount of time by this point. However, what Joe did not disclose prior to boarding passengers was that he actually made some non-regulation modifications to his balloon. The alterations were done to his burner system, and they unfortunately would end up causing an absolute catastrophe. At one point in the day, Joe would end up doing one of his passenger rides, and despite the fact that the balloon was only rated to safely carry 8 people, this trip would have 9 people aboard it, including Joe, meaning he accepted one more paying passenger than he was supposed to. Among these 8 people were 2 couples, Richard Worth and Christina Robinson, and Nick and Pamela Brainerd. The other 4 people who were aboard remain unnamed. The hot air balloon flight went off without a hitch. It was actually a very smooth ride. There were no power lines or anything, so it wouldn't end up like the last video we discussed, and to make things even better, the weather was fantastic. Even as they descended, things would go completely fine. The trip was actually smooth the entire time through, and if you were any of the people aboard this balloon, you would have felt like you had nothing to worry about. Unfortunately though, just as the balloon touched down to the ground, the propane tanks that were on board exploded into a gigantic fireball, setting off the beginning of the most tragic accident in the festival's history. Immediately after the propane tanks exploded, the balloon was sent upwards back into the sky, sending everyone on board into a panic. A number of people on board were able to get out pretty quickly, including a lady who hopped out at around 30 feet and ended up with some spinal issues. The owner, Joe Gonzalez, also got out and he was pretty banged up, but he ended up fine, which is no shocker. Unfortunately, both of those couples that I had mentioned previously did not get out in time, and so they were put in a very dire situation and needed to make a decision very quickly. Because of the propane tanks, the balloon was on fire, and now with even more people being out of it, there was less weight, making the balloon ascend even quicker. So just to frame the situation one last time, we have 2 couples that just experienced a gas explosion, sitting in a burning hot air balloon basket that's rapidly ascending into the sky, with no plans to stop and with no pilot. There's very few situations in life I can think of that would be scarier than this. Horribly, at around 70 feet up, the fire on board would give the couples no choice but to remove themselves from the hot air balloon, plummeting all the way down to the surface below, and as you could probably guess, none of these 4 people made it through the event. Potentially the saddest part of this entire ordeal is that one of the couples, Nick and Pamela Brainerd, were caught on news cameras falling out of the hot air balloon, and they were said to be holding one another in each other's arms as they fell. This was all aired live on local television networks, and by some horrible twist of luck, their 14-year-old son Donnie happened to be at home watching the broadcast with his grandmother as it unfolded. Due to the quality and the lack of context, Donnie had no idea at the time that he was watching his parents fall. It was only later on that he found out, and he carried guilt for many years because he was actually the one who convinced them to go down there. Originally, they just wanted to go to the Sandia Mountains and view the festival from afar, but Donnie knew they would enjoy themselves more if they actually just visited the grounds because the mountains were just too far away. The balloon ride they took with Joe Gonzalez was just a random decision they made while they were there because it sounded exciting and the hundreds of other rides around them seemed to have no issues. Donnie Brainerd actually has an entire blog dedicated to the event, and when you read the story from his perspective, it's very interesting. Extremely sad, of course, but it's interesting, and despite struggling for a while, he ended up making a very good life for himself afterwards, so it's positive in many ways as well. The story of that day from his perspective is actually mind-boggling, and I'm going to read some excerpts here, but I highly recommend going to check it out yourself if you want to get the whole story. I'll link it below. Grande and I were talking about my date with the cute blonde from the beach while we ate breakfast. She wanted to know all about the girl and what we were going to do, but as we were talking, a breaking news broadcast came blaring out of the television. The reporter announced that there'd been a balloon crash and the following scenes were not suitable for children. The screen jumped to a very large balloon whose gondola was filled with passengers. As the balloon landed, we could see somebody jump out as if something was wrong. Flames appeared and the balloon began to rise back into the air. Several more people jumped out and the quick drop in weight caused the balloon to ascend rapidly. By this point, the gondola and balloon were on fire. As the balloon reached a substantial altitude, there was a series of explosions and a lot of fire rolling in every direction. I sat there with Granny, our attention fixated on what we were watching. Yet another large explosion followed by 2 people falling from the balloon. These people were holding onto each other as they fell to the ground. Smoke followed them as they plummeted down to the earth. The impact was brutal and there was no doubt that they could not have made it through that fall. It was a terrible scene. We just watched 2 people fall out of a hot air balloon and there was no doubt that the other passengers had passed as well. People were scurrying all over the place trying to help. The camera would occasionally focus back in on the balloon, which was engulfed by flames and disappearing over the horizon. Until my dying day, I'll never forget Granny, without taking her eyes off the TV screen, saying, "I sure do feel sorry for the families of those people." A short time later, a friend came over to hang out and get stoned with me. We went out to the backyard, lit one up, talked about the balloon wreck, and started throwing the football. Partway through our smoke, my friend glanced into the house. From the backyard, you could see the street in front through a large window. His jaw dropped wide open. He turned back to me and said that a police car was parked out in the street. I knew that they were there because of my dad's pot plants. Before I could say a word, my friend ran and jumped over the brick wall. I ran through the house and got to the front door just as a policeman knocked. When I opened the door, there was a policeman in a suit and 2 uniformed officers. I thought I could see my father and PJ standing out in the street with their backs to me. The police came in and, to my surprise, didn't say a thing about the pot plants. They told Granny and I that there'd been a terrible wreck involving Mr. and Mrs. Brainerd. The policeman didn't say that they were gone, he just said there was a terrible wreck. Granny, being the wise old soul that she was, looked the officer in the eye and said, "Are they dead?" There was a long pause while the policeman stared at me, but he then looked back to Granny and whispered, "Yes." Granny sat there with her hands over her face, crying. The policeman gently rubbed her back and tried his best to comfort her. I was still standing there stunned, thinking my grandparents had been killed. I'd never experienced anything like this before. I had no way to process what had just happened. I stood there frozen, trying to make sense of it all. How did it happen? Where was the car wreck? And why did it happen? After a few more events, I clearly understood that there was no car wreck. This had nothing to do with the car. My dad and PJ were the 2 people we'd watched being blown out of the balloon, falling to their demise. I had just watched my parents experience a drawn-out and violent end. I'd watched the whole thing not knowing it was 2 people who I dearly loved. Granny had said that she felt sorry for the family of those people, and it turned out that we were those people. I went into a deep shock that lasted for a long time. To make matters worse, I got a little lost in the confusion. My father was so popular and loved, not only in the family but in the community. People were flooding the house and everybody was beside themselves with grief. I can remember sitting in the corner, not able to move, not able to cry, not able to do anything but sit there stunned. This one's just absolutely pathetic and seriously involves a disabled person, so if you think that's going to make it difficult for you, it's probably best to just skip it. The video made the rounds back in 2017, but it's sort of just been forgotten, and there was an unexpected update on it recently that I think you might find a little satisfying, so that's the main reason I'm covering it. Back in May of 2017, a man from Delaware named Barry Baker Jr. was out and about in Westchester, Pennsylvania, and hanging out with a few of his friends. Based on how he was acting and the fact that it was 2:30 in the morning, I can only surmise that he was drinking or using something, but I can't say for sure. Either way, he ended up at a Westchester convenience store with his buddies to grab some cigarettes. This was all recorded on CCTV, and at some point in the middle of this journey, we see another individual pull up in a white vehicle to grab some stuff of his own from the store. And just as Barry Baker Jr. is exiting, he's kind enough to hold open the door for this patron. You would think at this point that perhaps Barry is just a decent community member, but if that was the case, I wouldn't be talking about this piece of shit. The man that Barry held the door open for was a 22-year-old man named Michael, and Michael suffers from cerebral palsy, a group of disorders that affects people's brains and nervous system. It usually manifests in some sort of movement issues like an affected gait or some sort of speech problems, but obviously severity will vary completely depending on the case. Michael enters the store and he walks around to grab what he needs, while Barry waits outside and opens his pack of darts, and nothing seems out of the ordinary. However, when Michael exits the store, we can see Barry begin to mock the way that he's walking, while the other guy outside holds back his laugh. All of this right in front of him. Barry notices this and stands there for a second, likely taken by surprise, when, completely out of nowhere, Barry winds back and strikes Michael directly in the face. Michael's unsurprisingly stunned, and if you've ever been randomly struck like this, you know exactly what he's feeling. He's trying to process it all, but realizes it probably isn't a good idea to stick around someone so volatile, so he hops back in his vehicle and heads out while Barry walks off like nothing happened. Again, I just can't put into words how much this type of thing infuriates me. I can watch the absolute worst things and be able to look at it objectively, but when it comes to an innocent person going through something like this, especially someone with a physical disadvantage, it's just an entirely different thing. If I ever saw something like this happen in person, you would never be getting another video from me. All things considered though, Michael handled this like a king, and he immediately reached out to law enforcement, to where Barry was arrested and posted his measly $2,500 bail. Things would completely escalate 2 weeks later though, when the footage was publicly released and the internet was taken by storm. People really started to push for a greater sentence, and this degenerate was plastered all over the news again and being referred to as the most wanted man in a multi-state search. His house was getting so many phone calls that he was forced to move, but eventually another warrant was put out for him on yet another crime, and Barry would go on the run completely. Although he did have a past record of car hopping, Barry wanted to turn his life around, and at this point he was a self-employed landscaper with a house and a girlfriend. Due to these actions though, he was going to be sent right back to square -1. I will say the guy had a super rough childhood. I'll spare the specifics, but it's still just no excuse for such an unwarranted act of degeneracy like this. While Barry was in hiding, he suspiciously had an old teacher write in a letter that said, "With all due respect, I believe Mr. Baker is a wonderful person and deserves another chance in our wonderful community." It didn't prove to be enough though, as the man would eventually be found hiding in a hotel room, arrested and given a $100,000 bail. After 6 months of back and forth, he was sentenced to 3 to 6 years in a state prison and was finally made to face responsibility for his actions. Not so surprisingly, this isn't where the story ends for Barry though, and if you don't already know where this is going, I think you're going to be pretty surprised. Almost 6 years later, on April 20th of 2023, a Pennsylvania resident would end up in a police chase while on their motorcycle, driving recklessly around Chester County. It's not known what caused the police to initially pursue the biker, but in the midst of the chaos, the motorcyclist would get in a severe traffic accident and end up not making it through the event. The motorcyclist who intentionally evaded police and perished in this accident was Barry Baker Jr. I don't want to chalk this up to karma for what he did to Michael or anything. Life's a bit more complex than that, but it's pretty crazy how this ended up happening, and it seems like no matter what this guy did, he could never stop ending up in the sights of law enforcement. At the end of the day though, this was his fault, as were the very large number of terrible decisions he made prior to this accident. I just didn't expect to see this when I remember this viral video, and went to go check for updates. Tornadoes need no introduction. They're one of Mother Nature's most terrifying forces, and if you're unfortunate enough to come in direct line with one, things don't usually end that well. They're actually pretty rare outside of the central US, and so it's safe to say that most people will go their entire lives without ever seeing one. Today though, we're looking at a couple friends who weren't so lucky and who had to experience a direct hit in one of the most terrifying ways I could ever possibly imagine. Just over a month ago, as of the posting of this video, a man named Brian Johnson, along with his dog and his friend Tony, made some plans to go out on their bass boat and get some fishing in, something they did quite regularly. They're both very experienced and were super excited to get out there, prepping earlier in the day and checking the weather to make sure it was going to be suitable. Brian did see that there was going to be storms in the area and a lot of barometric pressure variation, but he's familiar with all this, so he kept a very close eye on it and navigated it accordingly. It's not like there needs to be perfect weather every time you go fishing, but the wrong call can get you in trouble. Brian kept his eye on the radar, and a little later on, he saw that the storm was moving northeast, so he decided that he would continue with his trip, park very close to shore, and just keep an eye in the southwest so that in the event that anything bad happened, he could get out of there really quickly. The meeting time came, so the two fishermen and their dog got out to the dock, launched the boat, and started getting after it. There's a camera mounted on Brian's boat, and we can very clearly see the storm in the distance. Brian says that he was continually keeping an eye on it and was betting on the fact that it would travel more north in its path, continuing to miss them. And for a while that's exactly what happened. However, either the storm changed paths or Brian misjudged, and the two fishermen were starting to feel some wind and rain. This very quickly escalated into something much more serious. They claimed that by the time they even felt a little bit of wind, they could already tell it was far too late as it was exponentially increasing in intensity. They reeled in and planned to immediately get out of there with no plans to even load the boat, as their safety was a greater concern. Brian says at this point that his truck was only about 75 yards away, but even attempting to reach this would be futile as the storm began to come on extremely strongly. Unfortunately, what they didn't know at the time was that this wasn't just any storm. It was an EF3 tornado with winds rated at 161 miles per hour, and sadly for these two and their poor dog, they had a 0% chance of making it back in time. Things just happened too quickly. Within seconds, the crew couldn't even see or hear anything as they were being battered with extremely strong winds and near sideways rain. Brian actually says it was nearly impossible to breathe as well because of the intense air pressure, which honestly is something I've never even thought about when it comes to tornadoes. I've read a lot of stories and I obviously know about the ear popping part, but not being able to breathe is just something I've never thought about. Of course, it doesn't help that there's insane rainfall. The tornado continued to intensify all while the camera kept recording, and it makes for some of the most intense footage I've ever seen of a direct tornado hit. They try their hardest to stay composed, but communication's of course impossible, and so Brian decides he's just gonna try to beach the boat. After a little bit of fighting, he actually manages to direct it into some reeds, which are just the tall grassy plants you find in patches near lakeshore. So he gets close to the shore and into the plants, all while the storm is at max intensity, and then a short period of time later, the boat flips. It's at this point that the camera stops recording. After the boat flipped and the camera shut off, Brian tried to remove himself from under the boat, but he was caught on something and there wasn't much he could do as he happens to be inside of a full-blown tornado. He held onto the top of the boat as the water was rising, trying to flip it, trying to stand up, but he had no success. So eventually he just continued to hold on to the top of the boat and pray, claiming that when he did so, he felt a feeling of peace wash over him. Not the kind where you just accept your fate, but the sort of feeling where he just knew everything was going to be okay. And thankfully that's exactly what happened. The storm eventually calmed down and Brian made it through this horrible event. At this point though, he couldn't think about himself. All he could do was wonder whether or not his dog and his friend Tony had made it through alive as well. And I'm sure you were probably wondering the same thing, so let's get into it. Amazingly, as the storm was slowing down, Tony popped up from the other side of the boat, being in a similar situation as Brian. There was still no sign of their fisher dog Sam, but they had to flip the boat back to normal before doing anything, so when the storm fully passed, they got themselves out and got to work on trying to flip it back upright. Their first few attempts failed, having tried to do it with both their hands and their Tacoma, but after a few friends arrived, they were all able to work simultaneously to get it back upright. And in a wholesome ending, just as they flipped the boat, Brian's dog Sam popped right out and ran into their arms. It turns out he was hiding in some sort of compartment the entire time, and fortunately he ended up being totally okay. All three of them made it through this disaster, and in Brian's own words, him, Tony, and Sam the fisher dog were all spared by the grace of God that day. So yeah, it's a good ending. Of course, this entire thing could have been avoided by them just not taking this risk in the first place, and it doesn't even look like they had any life jackets on or anything, but they could have had those low profile ones that inflate, so there's no knowing for sure. I think if anything, at least the dog should have had one on. You also have to keep in mind how close to shore these guys were, and their level of experience. It was a risk they knew they were taking, and it just ended up going very badly. I just don't think the dog should have ever been put in this situation.